I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles had survived family rebellion, public scandal, and years of private tension inside his own household. But nothing prepared him for what William placed before him behind closed doors. The prince had uncovered a calculated effort by Camilla to influence members of the Privy Council before a crucial royal decision. Charles read the evidence once, then again, and when he finally looked at his son, the king appeared completely shattered. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William did not soften the accusation. He placed a slim briefing folder between them and explained that Camilla had been cultivating selected figures connected to the Privy Council before discussions concerning her long-term authority and protections within the monarchy. The Privy Council is the historic body of senior advisors that formally counsels the sovereign on important constitutional matters, which meant even the appearance of private pressure carried enormous consequences. Charles opened the folder, reached the second page, and stopped. Slowly, he removed his glasses. He said nothing. The silence frightened William more than anger would have. Charles had defended Camilla through years of criticism, humiliation, and family division. But this was different. The king was not being asked to defend his wife against public hostility. He was being forced to consider whether she had quietly approached people surrounding one of the crown's most sensitive constitutional channels without telling him. William watched his father's expression change, yet the future king refused to retreat. He explained that the evidence came from a documented internal account comparing meeting dates, invitations, and recorded communication patterns. This was not one harmless conversation. Charles turned another page. The pattern became harder to dismiss. Private approaches had been followed by carefully timed invitations. Messages had reached individuals linked to council business. One contact appeared shortly before a palace discussion, in which Camilla's future influence was expected to become deeply contentious. The monarch finally looked up, caught between the woman who had stood beside him and the son who would inherit the institution he was sworn to protect. Love demanded loyalty. The crown demanded truth. William then delivered the detail that broke whatever hope remained that this could be explained away. According to the documented chronology, Camilla's contacts had begun earlier than Charles understood, and had intensified whenever questions surrounding her future position approached decision points. The prince did not accuse her of controlling an outcome. He said something more disturbing. Someone had been trying to shape the atmosphere before an outcome could be reached. Charles closed the folder, but he did not push it away. His voice was low when he finally asked, "How long has this been happening?" William hesitated, knowing the answer would force his father to revisit months of conversations, dinners, private meetings, and assurances he had never questioned. Before Charles could decide what to do about the woman he loved, he had to confront something even more painful: why his wife, his son, and the institution around them had reached this point at all. For Charles, this was never merely a constitutional problem. It was brutally personal. On one side stood Camilla, the woman for whom he had endured decades of scrutiny and sacrifice. On the other stood William, the heir expected one day to inherit everything Charles was fighting to preserve. Now both relationships were colliding around the same accusation, and whichever side the king trusted would wound someone he could not afford to lose. William stepped out of the room but did not immediately walk away. He paused outside the closed door, knowing he had just forced his father to confront a choice no son would ever want to place before him. The Prince of Wales, the heir who stands first in line to inherit the crown, understood that exposing Camilla could look like an attack on his father's marriage. Yet silence carried an even greater danger. One day, he would inherit not only the throne, but every unresolved weakness left behind with it. Charles remained seated alone. The folder stayed closed in front of him, but he could not bring himself to move it. What humiliated him most was not simply the possibility that Camilla had acted beyond his knowledge. It was that William had discovered the pattern first. The king had spent years defending his wife against those who questioned her place beside him. Now his own son was asking whether that loyalty had blinded him to something happening inside the institution he was sworn to protect. Camilla sensed the change almost immediately. When she later spoke privately with Charles, his answers were shorter than usual, his warmth suddenly replaced by restraint. She asked whether something had happened. He told her only that there were matters he needed to understand before speaking further. The queen consort knew enough to recognize the distance. Someone had placed information before him, and for the first time she could not be certain whether her husband would instinctively defend her. William had feared exactly this moment. He had delayed confronting Charles because suspicion alone would never have been enough. A documented internal account had allowed him to compare invitations, private meetings, and recorded communication patterns, until the connections became difficult to dismiss as palace gossip or personal resentment. The future king wanted his father to see a pattern, not hear an accusation. That distinction mattered, because the issue was not whether Camilla wanted to replace royal authority. It was more subtle. She appeared determined to shape the people surrounding that authority before decisions affecting her own position were made. Charles finally understood why the folder felt so dangerous. If his wife had tried to build sympathy around the Privy Council before sensitive discussions, then the damage went beyond family mistrust. It touched confidence in the crown itself. But the fracture had not begun with William's evidence. Months earlier, during one carefully controlled royal gathering, Camilla had remained behind after others left, and a conversation behind a closing door had quietly changed everything. Long before William confronted his father, one moment had already convinced him that something was wrong. It happened after a formal royal reception, when most guests believed the important conversations were finished. William noticed Camilla remain behind with a senior figure linked to Privy Council affairs. What followed appeared polite, almost harmless. Yet one sentence, overheard and later confirmed, transformed an awkward encounter into the trigger for everything that came next. William had previously treated the tension around Camilla as a painful family problem, not a constitutional threat. Arguments over status, precedent, and future royal roles were uncomfortable, but they were hardly unusual inside a monarchy preparing for another generation. That changed at Windsor. After the reception ended, the queen consort asked a senior council-connected figure to remain behind, and raised concerns about future decisions that might restrict her access and influence. The Privy Council, the historic body that formally advises the sovereign on certain constitutional matters, carried too much weight for such conversations to feel casual. William returned toward an adjoining room moments later and heard the words that stayed with him. Camilla said the monarchy would need experienced voices around the king whenever sensitive decisions were discussed. The prince stopped. He did not enter. He did not confront her. But something about the timing disturbed him. She was not merely defending herself to Charles. She appeared to be speaking directly to someone whose relationships could matter when difficult royal choices reached the sovereign. Catherine listened carefully. When William later repeated the phrase to her in private, he was unsettled, caught between instinct and proof, while she immediately understood the danger of moving too fast. The princess warned that accusing Camilla without evidence could permanently damage his relationship with Charles and make every later concern look like personal resentment. William agreed. That was precisely why he remained silent. But silence did not mean he forgot. William began quietly comparing dates, invitations, private meetings, recorded contacts. What initially looked like one uncomfortable Windsor exchange slowly became part of a broader pattern. A documented internal account later showed that one individual contacted after that reception subsequently supported a position unusually favorable to Camilla, retaining access during future discussions. The prince still could not prove that she had dictated anyone's view, but the sequence was enough to deepen his suspicion. The problem was no longer what Camilla had said, it was who she had chosen to say it to. Camilla eventually sensed the questions moving around her. She learned that past meetings were being compared, and that William had begun asking carefully worded questions about who had spoken with whom before sensitive palace discussions. The queen understood immediately where the trail led. The moment she realized the prince was tracing those contacts, the quiet contest ended. Father, son, and wife were now moving toward the same confrontation, and once that door closed, there would be nowhere left to hide. Charles could have dealt with the accusation through advisors. He could have buried it beneath procedure and allowed officials to speak for everyone involved. Instead, he demanded something far more dangerous. William and Camilla would face each other directly. No public statements, no protective intermediaries. The king wanted the truth spoken in the same room. But when William began describing what he had uncovered, Camilla did not look frightened. She looked furious. William began with Windsor. He repeated the conversation about experienced voices, then moved through the later contacts he had traced, one by one. Camilla pushed her chair back and demanded to know whether the prince had been monitoring her private relationships. The Privy Council, the historic body that formally advises the sovereign on certain constitutional matters, now sat at the center of the dispute, because the people being discussed were not ordinary palace acquaintances. Their proximity to formal royal advice made every private approach more serious. Charles raised one hand and forced the room back into silence. He asked Camilla whether she had contacted council-connected figures because discussions about her future royal role were approaching. His voice weakened slightly on the final words. The king was no longer listening as a husband alone. He was trying to determine whether William had mistaken ordinary relationship building for interference, or whether his wife had knowingly moved closer to people whose opinions might matter before decisions affecting her were made. Camilla refused to accept William's version of her motives. She insisted that she had spent years being judged by people who never truly accepted her and had every right to protect herself against decisions shaped by old hostility. The queen consort said speaking to experienced figures did not mean controlling them. William answered immediately. Protecting yourself, he said, was one thing. Quietly shaping the people expected to advise the crown before your own future was discussed was something else entirely. Neither moved emotionally. Neither backed down. Camilla finally acknowledged that she had spoken privately with influential figures, but she rejected the idea that she had tried to direct any formal outcome. That partial admission hit Charles harder than denial would have. The monarch had hoped the entire pattern might collapse under direct questioning. Instead, part of William's account had just been confirmed by the woman he had spent years defending. William then named one more contact. Camilla went still. Charles turned toward her immediately, because this was a name she had never previously mentioned to him. The room changed in an instant. The king stopped the argument before either side could continue, not because he had chosen William over Camilla, but because the question had become bigger than both of them. Charles now wanted to know exactly what those private relationships could have affected. The family confrontation had exposed the wound. What came next would reveal the machinery beneath it, and that machinery threatened to make Camilla's campaign look far more dangerous than a battle inside one royal marriage. Behind the emotional explosion sat a colder reality. The Privy Council was not simply another palace committee that could be charmed, ignored, or reshuffled at will. Its relationship to the sovereign carried history, constitutional weight, and extraordinary symbolism. That was precisely why William considered Camilla's contacts so serious. And when Charles finally understood what his son feared, The king's devastation began turning into something else: resolve. Charles summoned a trusted senior advisor and stripped the issue down to one question. Could Camilla's contacts create even the appearance that council judgment was being privately conditioned? The Privy Council is the body of senior advisors who formally counsel the sovereign and take part in important constitutional acts, which means even informal influence around its members can damage trust far beyond ordinary palace politics. The advisor hesitated before answering. Then came the word Charles did not want to hear. Yes. The king pressed both palms against the table and said nothing for several seconds. That answer changed the weight of everything William had shown him. Charles could no longer treat the matter as a family argument exaggerated by old wounds. If private relationships appeared to shape people connected to formal royal advice, then the credibility of his own judgment could be questioned. And if he defended Camilla automatically, he risked damaging not only his bond with William, but his standing as the sovereign expected to protect the institution above personal loyalty. William remained focused on that distinction. In a documented chronology prepared from recorded contacts, invitations, and meeting dates, the prince pointed to several approaches, clustered around periods when Camilla believed restrictions on her future role might be discussed. He did not claim she had successfully changed a formal decision. That was not the point. The future king argued that the danger existed in the attempt to build sympathetic pressure before those decisions were reached. Influence did not have to succeed to become dangerous. The effort itself could poison confidence. Charles read through the chronology again, this time without the emotional resistance that had shaped his first reaction. The pattern was too carefully timed to ignore. He knew Camilla might still insist she had been protecting herself rather than interfering with royal business, but intent no longer erased consequence. The king had reached the moment every sovereign fears, when private loyalty must yield to public duty. Charles made his first decisive move. He ordered an immediate review of all informal palace channels between Camilla's household and figures connected to council affairs. No quiet exceptions, no personal assurances. Every relevant contact would now be examined. That order changed the atmosphere overnight. What had begun as William's accusation was now an internal reckoning with real consequences. And when Camilla learned who had authorized it, she understood something devastating at once. Charles had stopped shielding her from what came next. The first consequence did not arrive through a speech or dramatic public announcement. It arrived quietly. A member of Camilla's household was informed that several informal contacts would cease immediately, and future communication involving constitutional figures required tighter approval. When Camilla was told, she did not explode. She simply asked whether the instruction had come personally from Charles. The answer was yes. For the first time, she understood that her husband had placed the crown between them. Camilla received the instruction in a private sitting room and read the first paragraph twice. The queen consort, the king's wife who holds royal status beside the sovereign but does not exercise his constitutional authority, understood immediately what the wording meant. Charles had tightened the boundaries around her household while the purpose of the contacts was examined. William had been deliberately kept away from enforcing those limits, because the king did not want anyone claiming that his son was using palace machinery against his stepmother. Camilla placed the page flat on the table and asked her aide to leave. Anger came first. Hurt followed. She had expected Charles to question her, even to challenge her, but she had not expected him to act before offering reassurance. The woman who had spent years believing that her marriage would protect her from complete isolation now faced something colder. Her husband was separating himself from her decisions, and the distinction felt brutally personal. Charles entered later and found no argument waiting for him. Camilla asked only whether he intended to reverse the review once tempers cooled. The king told her he could not undo it simply to protect their relationship. The answer cut deeper than shouting would have. She accused William of waiting for years to find a reason to reduce her influence. Charles refused to agree. He said the issue was no longer what his son wanted. It was whether the crown could afford uncertainty around private pressure and constitutional business. Camilla understood the refusal for what it was. Charles was not defending William personally, but he was no longer defending her automatically either. Then another detail surfaced. The internal review found that some of the disputed approaches had been described as relationship maintenance, a harmless-sounding phrase used for keeping useful personal connections active. William believed the wording concealed something more deliberate, a coordinated effort to create sympathy before sensitive decisions reached the king. Charles still had not delivered his final judgment. That uncertainty now weighed on everyone. Camilla feared what came next. William knew the evidence had already wounded his father, and the king understood that procedure alone could not settle what remained between them. Before deciding Camilla's fate, Charles asked William to meet him alone. No files, no advisors, no one else in the room. For all the constitutional language surrounding the crisis, its decisive moment would come down to something painfully simple: a father and son speaking with nothing left between them. When William entered the room, Charles had removed every folder from the table. There were no officials to interpret his words, and no notes to hide behind. The king asked his son one question: was this really about Camilla? William could have answered yes. Instead, he told his father the deeper truth. He was afraid the monarchy they both served was becoming vulnerable to private loyalties that future generations would be forced to repair. Charles poured water for both of them himself, and pushed one glass toward his son. Then he made the purpose of the meeting clear. He did not want the evidence repeated. He did not want another timeline of contacts, or another explanation of who had spoken to whom. The monarch wanted to know why William had refused to let the matter go. The crown, meaning the institution and authority of the monarchy, rather than simply the person wearing it, would one day pass to his son. That made the answer painfully important. William chose his words carefully. His greatest fear, he admitted, was inheriting an institution weakened by decisions nobody trusted, because family influence had been allowed to blur constitutional boundaries. The prince said he could live with criticism, tension, even personal resentment. What he could not accept was the possibility that future royal decisions might carry a shadow over them, because private relationships had shaped the people around those decisions first. Charles listened without interrupting. For the first time, he did not hear rebellion in William's voice. He heard fear. Not fear of Camilla herself, but fear of inheriting problems his father had been too emotionally compromised to confront. The king understood how brutal that admission was. His son was not trying to seize authority early. He was trying to protect the authority Charles still held. William then said the words he had avoided from the beginning. He knew challenging Camilla had hurt his father personally. He knew it had forced Charles into a position no husband wanted to face. But silence, he said, would have been a worse betrayal. The future king could not promise loyalty to the monarchy while ignoring something he believed threatened confidence in it. Charles finally accepted the motive behind everything. He told William that Camilla would retain her dignity and her position beside him. There would be no public humiliation and no attempt to destroy her standing. But any informal effort to influence council-connected figures concerning her own status would end permanently. The line was now clear. William did not celebrate. Charles did not look relieved. Yet something between father and son had shifted. They left that room closer than they entered it. But beyond those walls, the first signs of the extraordinary confrontation were already reaching the public. And once that happened, nothing about the crisis would remain private. By morning, the private crisis had become impossible to contain. Broadcasters led with extraordinary claims of tension between the king, the queen, and the Prince of Wales. Commentators debated constitutional influence, while crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, searching for signs of movement behind its gates. Yet one front page captured the national mood more brutally than any panel discussion. A photograph of Charles between William and Camilla beneath a headline asking who truly held the king's trust. Charles watched the coverage in silence. Palace communications had refused to discuss the private confrontation itself, but officials confirmed that internal procedures governing contact around constitutional business were being reinforced. Those procedures were the rules controlling how royal households communicate around formal matters of state, and tightening them sent a clear message without exposing every private detail. The king knew why it mattered. If the public believed family loyalty could shape people connected to formal royal advice, trust in the institution could weaken far beyond this one dispute. Outside Buckingham Palace, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Crowds gathered behind the barriers, while broadcast crews delivered live reports and held newspaper front pages toward the cameras. One image dominated everything. Charles positioned between Camilla and William, his face caught between his wife and heir. The symbolism was brutal. Some commentators praised the monarch for drawing a constitutional line. Others argued that the queen consort was being publicly isolated after years spent standing beside him through criticism and hostility. Camilla felt that judgment deeply. What she had believed could remain a private battle over influence had turned into a public verdict on her entire royal life. The queen saw years of loyalty reduced to one question: had she crossed a boundary to protect her place? Charles watched the discussion shift from constitutional procedure to speculation about their marriage, then quietly asked for the television to be turned off. The king could defend institutional discipline. He could not bear watching strangers turn that discipline into predictions about whether his marriage would survive. William found no satisfaction in the moment. Catherine discovered him withdrawn, aware that being vindicated had come at a painful cost. The prince had exposed what he believed was a dangerous pattern, but he had also forced his father into the most personal crisis of his reign. She reminded him that protecting the crown did not mean he had to enjoy the consequences. He did not. The palace then made the change unmistakable. Personal royal relationships would remain separate from private approaches connected to formal council matters. The channel William had identified was effectively closed. The institution had protected itself, but the hardest decisions still waited behind closed doors. Charles now had to decide what forgiveness meant for Camilla, what trust meant for William, and whether either relationship could ever return to what it had been before. There was no banishment, no theatrical stripping of rank, no final scene of royal revenge. Charles chose something quieter, and, for everyone involved, far more permanent. Camilla would remain beside him, but the private effort to shape opinion around the Privy Council was over. William would not be punished for exposing it. And the king, who had spent years defending both his marriage and his monarchy, finally accepted that protecting one could never require compromising the other. Charles established the boundary himself. Camilla and her household would no longer privately cultivate figures connected to council business when decisions concerning her own standing or influence were involved. The Privy Council, the historic body that formally advises the sovereign on important constitutional matters, would remain protected from even the appearance of family pressure. William's evidence was accepted as proof that a genuine boundary had been crossed, but the king refused to turn that finding into a personal victory for his son. This was not about defeating Camilla. It was about restoring trust. Charles later spoke with Camilla alone. There was no anger left in his voice when he told her that she remained his wife and queen. Then came the condition that changed everything between them. He asked for one promise: never again place him in a position where defending her required him to question whether he was also failing the crown. Camilla did not argue. she did not return to William's motives or defend the contacts again. The Queen quietly agreed, knowing the real consequence was not the loss of rank. It was that her husband's trust now carried limits it had never carried before. William faced Charles afterward with no sense of triumph. The king told his son that an heir sometimes had to deliver truths a sovereign desperately wished were false. The prince answered that he had never wanted his father to be hurt. That mattered. Charles finally understood that William had not fought to weaken him. He had fought because he feared inheriting a monarchy already weakened by questions nobody had been willing to confront. Charles emerged from the crisis shattered, but not defeated. The pain came from recognizing that love could never exempt anyone from the standards demanded by the crown. Camilla kept her place, but lost the freedom to use private relationships around constitutional business. William gained his father's respect, but the victory brought him no joy. And that was the true cost of William's revelation. Camilla remained beside the king. William remained his trusted heir, but Charles could never again pretend that family loyalty and royal duty were the same thing. The crown survived because, when forced to choose, he finally drew the line. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.